The TARDIS sat in several inches of fresh snow as a new flurry blew around it in a breathtakingly picturesque manner. Had the Doctor not been very preoccupied as he entered, he would have mused to himself his home of these many centuries looked as if it should be in a snow globe on a mantelpiece, above a warm, roaring fire holding back the midwinter chill. But the Doctor was preoccupied with his last moments of life. The question was, were these the last moments of his entire life, or merely this life? Minutes earlier, he was irrevocably set on this being the end. He had lived longer than most of his people did. He had experienced an entire extra lifetime with his bouffant grey hair, intense stare and angry attack eyebrows who had a life of their own. But nothing lasts forever, and this, he felt, was his time to die. His faithful and loving TARDIS had said no, however. She had taken him on a journey that reiterated to him what life actually was for, what it was about, and ended in the snow of the impromptu Christmas truce in the trenches of the Great War on December 24th, 1914. How exquisitely perfect a time and place for a pacifist who was constantly at war. And then he was given the most beautiful Christmas gift. Treasured memories, long thought lost forever. Memories of the first face this face ever saw. And when he looked into those forgotten eyes and the memories came flooding back, he knew this wouldn't be the end. But at the same time, he knew he'd have to talk himself into it. Which is what he was doing now, as he wearily staggered to and fro around the console room. Several hundred miles away in London, just off Soho Square, Edith Thompson scoured at the shattered container of salt on the kitchen floor. Mary, the scullery maid, had dropped it and now trembled before Edith. Even though Edith had been the cook of the house for nearly 2 decades, she remembered her time as a scullery maid well, and it being Christmas, she decided she was going to show Mary some uncharacteristic empathy and understanding, rather than the notoriously sharp edge of her tongue. "Oh, just fetch the broom and clean it up," she sighed. Mary didn't need to be told twice, and off she rushed to not tempt fate and see a reversal of her good fortune. Edith knelt down and picked up a few fingers full of salt and threw it over her shoulder. "That should keep the devil at bay," she muttered to herself. Sadly, that was the very opposite of what was going to happen. A few grains of salt got caught on a gust of air and were carried outside through a window opened only just a crack to allow the steam from the preparations for tomorrow's Christmas feast to escape. The grains of salt circled in the cold air and seemed to multiply rapidly, creating a strange vortex of salt. The combination of salt and superstition had transformed the ordinary sodium chloride into something altogether unique. It was now a bridge, a conduit, a beachhead in this reality from another far, far away. A vast time, space, and reality warping event entered this realm, riding on the back of the salt, and took on a new avatar for this new, tantalizing world. Reaching out to the consciousnesses of the beings closest to it, it took the form of the recently deceased Captain Robert Johnson. The entity's name remained the same as it had done for millennia, however. After being introduced to the concept of games and play by an Eternal that happened to become ensnared in its realm eons before, the entity came to be defined by those concepts. Games, play, and vowed would become the ultimate creator using these delightful ideas, and thus became the Toymaker. The vortex of salt swirled and formed into a visage of the Toymaker's new body as he corporalized into this reality, quite unnoticed by any of the nearby pedestrians hurrying to their destinations on the cold Christmas Eve winter air. He was unnoticed because the Toymaker had decided not to allow anyone to see him, as yet. Now fully formed, he reached out his consciousness and examined this new realm he had been given access to, and he giggled with delight. The games and accompanying deceptions that filled this world were giddying in their breadth and intricacy. These people really understand the depth and importance of play, the Toymaker mused to himself. Even simple games of cards or dice could, and often did, end with violence and death. They trained their young in the arts of game-playing from the moment they can crawl. He extended his consciousness further and giggled with glee once again. Far away, men played with little wooden soldiers on a table, but incredibly orders were then given that real people, with real flesh, blood, hopes and fears, should emulate the movements of their wooden counterparts, leaving that flesh, blood, hopes and fears bleeding into a dirty, sodden battlefield. The Toymaker discovered war and it was all over the globe. He could feel the horror and misery it caused and let out an unintentional guffaw of delight. The largest of these obscene games of death at this moment in time was called the Great War. The Toymaker nudged his consciousness outside of space-time and laughed when he saw more, far more greater wars coming on the heels of this one. The war that was supposed to end all wars. And then in the midst of a battlefield, where the combatants had taken a few days to refuse to reenact the movement of their tiny wooden counterparts, he tasted something utterly delicious. Artron energy. Fresh Artron energy. He sniffed for the source and clapped his hands together with glee. It was coming from a tiny time-space capsule with some very familiar biodata inside. The Doctor. That infuriating little being had bested him in one of his games. Bested him. The utter nerve. But then he wasn't quite as clever as he thought. He inadvertently created his salt and superstition-laden pathway to this realm. And there he was now, utterly helpless. He was in the midst of some form of total cellular regeneration and rejuvenation. The Toymaker straddled the Doctor's timeline and began playing with it with a gusto. At first, he just shunted a time paradox where one corporal being met itself at an earlier time frame back 5 years, just to see what would happen. And other than an office at the United Nations being set up to try and reconcile the temporal confusion with their intelligence task force, no one really noticed. Then the Toymaker really got to work. With a flick of his fingers, one face of the Doctor's was half human, on his mother's side, which deliciously made little to no sense because his people didn't have mothers. And then they did. And then they didn't. Looms came and voodoo time cults went in a flurry of opposing histories. The Toymaker centered himself in the here and now as the Doctor regenerated his form. Giggling with delight, the Toymaker changed the Doctor's next persona like a sliding block puzzle. In one moment, the Doctor regenerated into the same face and went on to have adventures on ancient Mondas and tour the Albion Empire with old friends. In the next, all that was gone. And gone with it was the Doctor's towering intelligence, replaced instead by a nauseating sense of entitlement. The Toymaker then warped the Doctor's fierce sense of morality and individuality and substituted it by a need to follow the vicissitudes of the herd. And then to top it all, he changed the Doctor's gender. That's when the TARDIS spat her out in disgust. Oh, how the Toymaker laughed. He would have to remember to include a baffling acceptance of gender confusion in the games to come. Maybe aiming it at some of the humans that traveled with the Doctor. Maybe even all of them. The Toymaker giggled with delight at the thought. Then the Doctor's home was a restored empire. Then it was destroyed. And then the Doctor didn't have a home at all, and was an adopted orphan from a nonsensical hole in reality. A flux event that wiped out 3 planets morphed into an event that destroyed most of the universe, and hilariously, it was all the Doctor's fault. By the time the idiot blonde female Doctor the Toymaker created regenerated, she had committed genocide several times over and led the human race to total obliteration from the Cybermen. Craving some form of consistency and normalcy, the Doctor's next face was an older one. The Toymaker joined in on the game by changing the Doctor's clothes to match his old face. The Toymaker recognized this face as the one who kindly created this bridge to this realm, so decided to stop playing with his timeline. Now the game was really afoot. The Toymaker would devise an exquisite game just for the Doctor, a game that crossed space-time and reality, and would almost certainly end up with this impudent Doctor being a puppet on his strings. The Toymaker took a deep breath of the cold London air and exhaled. This had been his first, and what could only be the best Christmas ever. For the Toymaker, it was the most wonderful time of the year.